Hello, buddy. Welcome back. I'm the Strategy Professor, and today we're going to be doing part 2 of our guide for combat in Total War Warhammer, specifically Total War Warhammer 2, and special thanks to Westworld for sponsoring this guide. If you would like to sponsor a guide yourself, just email me at thestrategyprofessor@gmail.com. I'm happy to set that up for you. Right now, the going rate's about $30 per guide. I'll do about a 30-minute to 1-hour, well-researched, well-articulated guide for you. If you would like to check out the rest of the content, be sure to check it out on the main channel as well, The Strategy Professor on YouTube. We have several guides. We have over 40 legendary campaigns and a lot of other content, so be sure to check that out. And I have been streaming some Total War lately after my League stream. It usually starts around 1:30 a.m. or 2 a.m., depending on what's going on, Eastern Standard Time. So be sure to check that out if you enjoy it. And look at part 1 of this if you haven't looked at that as well. I have a link in the description. In that part 1, we went over all of the different stats, what they mean, in terms of how to think about combat and how you can optimize which types of stats and items that you're getting. In this guide, or in this part, we're going to be talking about different tactics that you can use on the battlefield and how to prepare. So how to think about battles before you get to them so that you have a good game plan in mind and so you can execute that game plan on the battlefield. So it's going to be a combination of sort of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different factions, understanding how to identify your strengths as a particular faction leader, and then how to take those strengths and use them on the battlefield. So it'll be pre-planning, and then we'll talk about tactics in the battle itself in the second half of the video. But let's go ahead and get back in here. So in general, it's really good just to have a basic grasp of the different strengths and weaknesses of the major factions around the map. This is dramatically oversimplified, of course, and different legendary lords will affect the gameplay quite a bit. But it's good to understand that not only if you play that, but if you play against that. So if you are Skaven versus Lizardmen, for example, early on, you need to understand what they're really good at so that you know what you need to counter, right? So, for example, using that example, they have very strong level 1 infantry. So the Saurus are probably the most powerful infantry in the game at level 1. And I'd say even at level 2, they're very, very strong. And the AI, particularly at higher difficulty levels, has a really strong economy early on. They get a lot of baseline income. So it's not uncommon for them to come at you with a stack of 15 Saurus, whatever. That's really, really hard to beat as Skaven early because they match up very well against the Skaven. They are very heavily armored. So Skaven does not have good armor piercing. Early on in the game, you're going to have to wait until you get to the Death Runners at level 4 before you have good armor piercing on your infantry. And then they're not going to be able to get a lot of... I mean, I guess you can get Rat Ogres, and that is a solution. That is one possible solution to them that you can do as Skaven at level 3. As long as you're able to stay out of the spears, you want to measure up how many swords versus how many spears they have. So that is an option if you were... in that situation. You can also use your artillery to soften them up and use some skirmishers like your Night Runners, or even just Skaven slaves with slings, just to kind of slow them down a little bit, get them to split up, just not let them come at you in that death ball formation. And then play claw catapults are pretty good. The fact that they have so much HP, though, does make that a little more dangerous of a tactic. But it can work. But that's the kind of thing you need to be thinking about. It's like, okay, this faction's going to be doing this early on. What is that? And how can I counter it with my specific faction? Because if you go in against the Lizardmen and you're trying to just rush like a bunch of clan rats and you just run them into their, even if you're rushing Stormvermin early on and you're trying to run those directly into the Saurus, you are going to lose, most likely, right? I mean, you can get a lot of advantages with flanking and other tactics, but you're going to be in a very bad spot, right? So it's just important to understand that. And also to understand timing and tempo. So that's the early game for the Lizardmen. They have really strong infantry, but their infantry falls off really hard later. They just really don't have other good infantry for a really long time. You can eventually get Temple Guards. They have some okay halberds, but they have very weak swords, things like that, compared to things like Great Swords or Sword Masters of Hoeth. A lot of other factions are going to have better infantry later in the game. So the Lizardmen transition from kind of this early game powerhouse with the Saurus into a later game monster-themed units with really large, heavily armored monsters. So they're still going to have a lot of armor, but now they're going to be large. And so things like catapults aren't going to work so well against Stegodons and Bastillodons and all of that kind of stuff. So, you need to understand at what point in the game you're fighting these factions and then how to adjust your units and your gameplay towards that. So you might want to go more towards spears and halberds in the mid to late game against lizardmen versus early game. You want to get stuff that can counter large clumps of Saurus infantry, like cavalry, large monsters, things like that. Okay, so here's just a really quick overview of like the very general, like 2-sentence version of strengths and weaknesses of the different factions, so you kind of know what you're going up against. And if you're starting off playing these factions, then you kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses might be. So High Elves are going to have great early anti-large and really good bows. So this usually comes from the Lothern Seaguard. I was blanking out on the name, but the AI especially loves to get a ton of Lothern Seaguard. Lothern Seaguard are very, very difficult to deal with most of the time. They're one of the most powerful units in the game, pound for pound. There are a ton of upgrades you can get for them with the High Elves, but the thing that makes them so dangerous is they can get silver shields, and they have pretty respectable range and pretty respectable damage for an archer. They're very accurate, and they have a high arcing shot. So that means that they're going to line up well against most other archers in the game. Things like Quarrelers might be able to beat them at a certain point, because Quarrelers are going to have more armor. That is kind of a weakness of these, is if you are against heavily armored archers, which there are not many of those in the game, especially early on, then that could potentially be a problem. They're also pretty mobile from what I remember. I don't remember their exact move speed, but I think it's a little bit higher than average. I think it's like maybe 38 move speed or something like that. So they can outrun a lot of kind of your slower, heavily armored infantry. So that means they're very, very good. And then they also have spears. So that's the real kicker, is that they are pretty decently armored, silver shielded units with great range, all that other stuff, and they have spears on top of it. So if you do manage to run into them with light cavalry, they're going to tear up the light cavalry too, because they have those spears. They run out of ammo, which you can get a lot of ammo upgrades. That's unlikely they're going to run out of ammo. But if they do, then they can still go in there, and they're still decent melee combatants. So they're just kind of like almost an unfair jack-of-all-trades type of thing. They are fairly expensive early on, but they are very good. Now, later on, they do fall off. They are tier 3, but they do not have very good armor-piercing damage, and like some of the really dangerous cav that have huge charge bonuses can tear them up later on, especially heavily armored cav. But, so that's kind of their strength. Usually, and the AI is going to play up to that, is these High Elves are very, very good with these specific archers. However, they're weak to cavalry, other than, they do have the anti-large properties there, but like I said, it's not going to stand up too well against some of that, like, higher tier cavalry. Once they get, like, up to tier 5, they have pretty good cavalry with the Dragon Knights. But I haven't run the math on them, but I'm pretty sure that other large, like, anti-cavalry units, like demigriffs and stuff, would shatter those top-end things. But they do have dragons as well. I don't know why I said no monsters, because they definitely do have they have dragons at tier 4 and tier 5. I would just say no mid-tier. I kind of zoned out there on, they have the best dragons in the game. Late game. So they do have late game monsters. So they are like okay in the early game. They are beatable. Once they start getting those Lothern Seaguards, it does get a bit tougher. But they're notably like very weak at tier 3. All they have is the Lothern Seaguard going on, and then it's really going to be those later tiers when they start getting the dragons, and when they can start getting like the Sword Masters of Hoeth, when they're going to get pretty dangerous. So they are one of the more powerful factions in the game, I think. They do have a pretty decent chunk of like versatility, in that they have very good sword-on-sword combat. They have good large dragons in the late game. And they have pretty good bows. And now they have the Sisters of Avalorn, which were introduced a few DLCs ago, which gives them actually pretty good armor piercing later on for some very expensive archers, but very potent archers. So they are quite good. So if you want to hit them, you definitely want to hit them at tier 3 if you get a really nice power spike before they get their dragons and before they get some of these other things going on. Okay. Wizardmen, we talked about that. They have very strong early infantry and really strong like early monsters. So they can get things like Stegodons at tier 3, which is pretty rare. A lot of factions can't get those kind of big, like huge HP monsters until later. And all of their heroes and lords can also get very large monster mounts. So you're just going to be facing a flood, just a huge stack of armor and HP, usually when you're fighting against the Wizardmen. And so that can be very difficult for a lot of factions to deal with. So you would definitely, like in the mid game, if they have a lot of monsters, you definitely want to pack the halberds and spears if your units have them. Anything else like Has heavy armor piercing damage. Like, this is actually a place where gunpowder units would be pretty good because you're going to be hitting huge monstrous units that aren't going to have shields a lot of the time. And so things like rifles, things like rattling guns from Skaven, cannons, stuff like that is going to be fairly effective against what they're working with. So they're going to be weak to spears overall. Like I said, they don't have very good infantry, like late game infantry. They have very strong early game, but not so great late game infantry. And they have really weak archers. They just have like these blow dart skinks, which are okay, but they're skirmishers. And they don't have shields, and they usually have very low armor. So they're going to be weak to things like the Lothern Sea Guard. Okay, Dark Elves. I think Dark Elves are definitely in the running for most OP faction. They're very close. They're extremely powerful. They have a very good early game. Good mid and really good late games. They have great bows and great infantry early on. The Dark Shards are not, the Dark Shards with their armor piercing and their silver shields are very, very good archers at tier 2. They have even better archers at tier 3 with the Shades, which do a tremendous amount of armor piercing damage. They have a lot of upgrades to them, and they're very good in combat. What's up, dear? Did video. Okay.
To bust your table.
Thanks, dear. So they're very good in that respect, and then they have the Black Art Corsairs. That's what I was looking for, and these are extremely strong early game infantry, and they are not very expensive at all. They're heavily armored. They're pretty fast moving. They get a bonus versus infantry, and yeah, they're just great. So lots of armor, lots of mobility, pretty low cost, and bonus versus infantry. So very strong. And there are like a lot of really good upgrades for them too, both in the tech trees and in lord trees. There's even an entire legendary lord, Karand Klar, I can't remember his name. But there's a guy who specializes in those and makes them cheaper. And you can use the Corsair that you have floating around at sea or whatever to hire them at level 1. So yeah, they're OP as hell. They're very, very strong. Dark Elves. And they get huge replenishment every time they win a fight, and you take slaves, which is what you almost always do. I'm pretty sure you get massive replenishment off of that as well. So they're very good. And then the fun doesn't stop there. Late game, they have some of the best infantry on infantry fighters as well with, I forgot what they are. They're like the Golden Mask, like death guys. I'm zoning out on the names right now. But I don't remember their name, but they're tier 5. They're extremely powerful infantry on infantry. They're some of the best in the game. And then they have the Black Guard of Nagorond as well, which are some of the best halberds in the game. And they can get Black Dragons at tier 4, which are some of the best dragons in the game. And they just have a lot of utility. Like they have access to fire magic, which is very strong on them. They have really good legendary lords with like very good skills. They have like some pretty good utility units with like the witch elves, and if you want to go for like the dinosaur cavalry or whatever, they can be pretty good. So they're just really well rounded, very, very strong. They can have a really powerhouse economy if you get a lot of slaves going. So they are an extremely powerful faction. So if you're gonna fight them, I mean, good luck. They're one of the toughest ones early on, but I guess like early maybe they're exploitable to cavalry. Like their cav's not going to be that great at tier 3. So if you have like some really nice infantry or some really nice like cavalry or fast monsters or something like that, then you can match up really well with the Corsairs. And you definitely need to tie up the Dark Shards early on in the Shades, but particularly the Dark Shards, because they do really heavy armor piercing damage on everything. So they just like tear through armor like no other. And that's what makes them like, they have shorter range, but the fact that they just mow through armor like it's nothing, I think gives them an edge potentially even on some of the high elf archers that I was talking about earlier, so the Sea Guard. So very strong. So just keep that in mind. Try not to mess with them early if you can at all help it, although it doesn't get much better late game either. I mean, they're just going to be really difficult to deal with. So just come prepared, like be ready, be very strong if you're going to fight the Dark Elves early. Skaven, and then we'll speed this up. I don't want this video to be super long. I'll go through the rest of them kind of quickly because there's a million of them here. Skaven, really weak overall units just in general. They have very strong artillery with their catapults, though, and then they have pretty good weapons teams, particularly with the new expansion. You have to use a lot of tactics with Skaven, and I've got a video of Skaven later where I'll show you. Actually, no, I have a video of Lizardmen versus Skaven, but I have done a Skaven campaign if you want to watch and kind of learn those tactics. But they're very weak individually. They have really good synergy, though. They can just summon a whole bunch of units and just swarm the battlefield and then just lock up a bunch of enemy units and just tie them up and just allow you to get the kind of matchups that you want to get. So, just allow you to get those rat ogres into their infantry, allow you to get your halberds into their cav. So they can't, and they get ambush all the time. They get different ambush effects. So they are very good, but you have to use them really well. And they can snowball really hard, especially in the early game once you get those catapults. They're very, very strong against a lot of other factions. They're cheap, and they just match up really well, especially against things like humans. They kind of have a harder time against lizardmen, but against other, especially lightly armored type of units, they can be very strong. Vampire Coast, they have pretty good early missile units. They have pretty good early monsters as well. Those Sirens are OP. I think they may have nerfed them at some point, but if you take Silosa and rush those Sirens, they're almost impossible to kill because enemy units are not going to have a lot of magic magic damage early. They are weak to cavalry, and they're weak to shields early on, though. They don't have... I don't know. It's just difficult for them to trade with their ranged units if you don't have the shields. And then the cavalry, it's been a while since I played Vampire Coast, but I don't think they have a lot of good spear units, if any at all. And that's a trait of a lot of undead. At least at the early levels, are not very good against large units. But that's kind of their thing. And then Tomb Kings, they're very good swarming. Now, they are really dangerous for the AI because the AI on higher difficulties on like Legendary and things like that, they're going to get buffs to a lot of different stats. And so like these large swarm type of factions can be difficult to deal with. So they have really good swarming. They have really good monsters later on. So things like their... their like Necrosphinx and whatever that other is, Chimerian Wars or Chimerian or however you pronounce that, War Sphinx. Those are very good. The Ashopti are great sort of tier 3 infantry shredders. They have huge armor and then deal a lot of damage to infantry. So, yeah, I mean, they're pretty good, but they're really weak later on to elite swords and cav. Like, the elite swords will crush. I mean, they do have some, like, Tomb Guard that are okay. They have pretty good defense, but I think in general, like, elite swords that are buffed up with proper positioning can be very, very good against them. And then cavalry is pretty weak, too. They don't have great anti-large. Really, they have to have, like, I think one of the Sphinxes does, like, some anti-large that's pretty good. Necrosphinx, I believe. But overall, like, they're just going to be pretty weak to large. They do have some, like, really dinky, like, early spears. I guess the halberds, you can get the Tomb Kings with, the Tomb Guard with halberds, but it's still going to be really difficult, I think, to deal with very good cavalry with good micro and elite swords. Okay, Empire, very versatile roster, very strong at tier 3 when they get those great swords. They traditionally, I think in the base game, were tier 4. Steel Faith brings them down to tier 3 and adjusts the stats a little bit. But either way, they have a lot of different things they can do. You know, they can have pretty good artillery. They have a pretty good diverse set of, like, infantry, both melee infantry and missile infantry. They have extremely good cavalry. I think that Demigryphs, if they're not the best, they're certainly in the conversation for best cavalry in the game. They have a lot of different kinds of magic you can get. They're diverse. So there's a very strong overall faction. Now, they are fairly difficult to micro, especially early on, because you have such great diversity. You don't really have a unit that you can just, like, spam and just, like, run into the enemy to kill them, like the Saurus for Lizardmen. You really have to think carefully about how you're composing your army, and you really have to micro it well. So if you want to go with more crossbows, you got to position around that more carefully. You want to go with more swords, you're going to have to... learn how to flank around to the back with the swords. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit when we talk about the tactics. But overall, they are one of the more difficult factions to micro correctly, and they're weak. They're weak to armor early on. They do not have a lot of armor piercing. So things like dwarfs, like quarrelers, are a very, very difficult thing to deal with early on for them. But that's their thing. All right, dwarfs, very strong early units. Infantry and bows, or crossbows rather, with the quarrelers are extremely strong. Dwarfs have a lot of HP, they have a lot of armor, and they have a lot of defense early on. So if you just get to stand there and just stay in combat with them, they're very good at long fights. Particularly the quarrelers, I think, are in the running for best missile versus missile infantry in the game. They're really, really close. They have heavy armor, 80 to 90 armor, and silver shields, and they do pretty good damage with the quarrelers. So Very difficult to deal with that. They're kind of like the Lothar and Sea Guard, but without the spears, without the anti-large, and instead they just have a ton of armor. So that's extremely powerful at level 2. You can beat up most factions if you just have just Dwarf Warriors plus Quarrelers, and they have some very good upgrades and technologies that you can get really early in the game to boost them up. So that's a very strong power spike for Dwarfs, or like the first 20 turns or so. You can gain a lot of property, gain a lot of power. Now, I think they're really weak late game in general, and I think they're really weak to cavalry and monsters specifically. They do have Slayers. Slayers are not a good solution, though. Slayers are extremely weak to missile units. They're very bad against melee infantry. So they're really only good against monsters, and unless they just let you sit there and beat them up with Slayers, it's going to be very difficult to deal with these large monsters when they're running around flanking you all the time. So, like, you can have some solutions to it, but they do not have halberds. They do not have spears that I'm remembering. It's just pretty much like you have to either focus fire out the monsters with your, like, Quarrelers or your Thunderers, or you have to get Slayers on them. So I think they're one of the weaker late game factions, and they don't have cavalry themselves. They don't have they do have gyrocopters. I guess gyrocopters are another advantage. That's pretty unique for them. There are some other factions that kind of have that, but the gyrocopters are actually very good air to ground type of unit. So you can get some gyros to help you deal with some things, but in general, they're going to be really weak to things like trolls, boar, stuff like that, especially in the mid game. Greenskin, strong early for a swarm faction. Their units actually have pretty good stats, considering how many of them you can get and how cheap they are, particularly the orcs. And if you do start snowballing, you get an extra army to run around with you, which can be very, very difficult to deal with, especially if you hire multiple lords and get multiple WAs going on. They are weak late to mid to late game without a WA, so their black orcs are okay. But really, their late game stuff has a hard time standing up against other factions in their late game. So you really have to do a strength through numbers type of approach and just, try to have a WA up at all times so that you have a numbers advantage on them. But if you do have that, they are a very, very good swarming faction. Okay, vampire counts. Very, very strong magic and heroes. I think the vampire heroes are some of the strongest in the game. Great late game, very expensive units, and they are weak to anti-large late game. So they really don't have a good answer to like halberds and things like that because their own sword infantry are really weak. So it's hard to punish halberds with the vampire counts, and a lot of your best units are going to be these large monsters later on. So your infantry, the grave guard, they're all right, but they're not as good as like great swords or a lot of other factions, sort of mid-game swords, and they don't have very good anti-large themselves. So, they do have some spears, like skeletons with spears are about as good as it's going to get. You do have the, Vargeist, I believe or was it, I think it's the Vargeist. I can't, the flying skeleton dragon thing. That thing does some pretty good damage, to large, but you're very limited in your options of anti-large later on. So keep that in mind. Norska, very mobile. They do have good monsters with like their skin wolves, but they are weak to missiles. A lot of them are not very heavily armored, and a lot of them don't have shields or don't have good shields. They might have some bronze shields, but in general, they're very weak to missile infantry. So if you have, very good archers, then you can definitely mow them down, and they have very low armor early on. But they do scale fairly well later in the game, from what I remember. They have a good like flying beast. They got the mammoths. So they can definitely make it happen. The skin wolves are pretty good anti-large beasts, so they're really good against other like cavalry and things like that later on. And then I don't remember all the stats for their I don't remember what the things are called. The little weird, they're not turtle looking, but the other monster things that they have some pretty good like debuffs on them. But that's sort of their problem overall is the light armor, and they just have like javelin throwers as their missile infantry, so it's pretty low range, although it does quite a bit of damage and quite a bit of armor piercing damage, I think. But so they're very good against large beasts. They're okay against like sword infantry lines, but they really have a hard time with missiles. Okay, Bretonia, excellent cavalry, very cheap units. You can field a lot of them, so you can spend more money on your elite units. That's pretty handy. They did just rework Bretonia. I haven't played them yet since the rework, but that is something to keep in mind with them. They have very weak infantry, though, from what I remember. They have, like, some sword guys, that are like tier 3 or tier 4, but they're not that great compared to other elite swords. So you could definitely get run over early. So you really, really need to leverage your cavalry. Like, you have to get good flanks off. You have to have really good charge cycling. They do have very, very good cavalry, especially in the mid game. Now, once again, I don't know how well those are going to line up against like Dragon Knights and Demigryphs and things like that. Probably okay, but definitely in the mid game, they're going to have some really strong, like very fast, high vigor, some of the best mid-game cavalry in the game. So be sure to take advantage of that. And they're actually surprisingly pretty decent missile, because they're so cheap to get those archers that they have, and they can get like some poison tips on the archers too, I think. So they have actually had pretty decent missiles, and their trebuchet is pretty good too for its price. So very cheap, like kind of trash units, but they're very effective. And I think you used to be able to get a ton of leadership to basically make them almost unbreakable, with how many different buffs you can get from different units and technologies and ward trees and things like that. I remember thinking you could get over like 100 leadership on most of your like trash units, and so they're almost unbreakable. So you can just throw them up there, and they're just like a super cheap unbreakable like line that can just sit there while you charge over and over again with your cavalry. Wood Elves, extremely strong bows, very good monsters, especially later on in the game. I think the Wave Archers are probably the best archers overall in the game. Sisters of Avalorn for the High Elves are pretty good too, but very, very powerful units. Now, they are weak, especially the Elves early on. They do not have a lot of armor. They are pretty fast, but they do not have a lot of armor, and they are not that great in combat. They are okay. There are some that are all right. But they're just kind of a weird mix of like the monsters are kind of slow, have a ton of armor, and can soak a lot of shots, like the tree guys and the treekin and the dragons. But then they also have these kind of like specialist elves, which tend to have high melee attack and defense, but really low armor and really low HP pools. So you kind of have to mix and match, but it's difficult to do that with Wood Elves because they really, like, their lord and sort of their mechanics force you to choose one or the other as your primary type of unit that you're getting. But they're interesting. And then Beastmen, great monsters, really fast. They do have some armor options, but they are weak to anti-large overall. They don't have great infantry on infantry units. They're okay. And then they have really weak bows overall, so they are going to be weak to archers as well. And then finally, Chaos, great melee, really good armor, good monsters later on, but they are very expensive. You cannot field a lot of those like higher end units. The mechanics of Chaos make it difficult to get a very diverse army as well. You kind of have to pick a couple of units that you really want to specialize in. They have very low mobility. A lot of their armor stuff is super slow, and they're very weak to bows. They don't have any archers themselves. They have really weak artillery in general. Their cannon's all right, but you have to go out of your way to try to get it. And so they can be worn down by other units. But I'm pretty sure they have the best infantry in the game. Like, just pound for pound, those Chosen, if money wasn't an issue, the Chosen are extremely strong, both against large and against other infantry. So, okay, so we've mentioned this some. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about the power spike here. I don't want this video to be super long, but I did just want to give like an introduction here to each one of these factions, just so you can kind of think about both how you might want to try to play the faction as well as, how the AI might play it. And if you want a specific guide where I just go in depth and talk about this is what you should do, with this specific faction, I can do that. I do have one for Skaven on the channel, the older school Skaven. That's about a year or so old. But I'm happy to do a guide for that if you're interested. Just email me at thestrategyprofessor@gmail.com if you want to discuss that. But I just wanted to give you, once again, just that overview there. Okay, so let's talk about playing around your power spike. So the important thing, we mentioned some of these things here, but just try to identify where you think you're going to have an edge on your opponent. And pay attention to who's close to you in your start position. Like, who are you going to have to fight? Are you close to Lizardmen? What is your win condition, right? How are you planning to sort of progress, right? So, for instance, if I'm starting in Empire, I know I'm going to be facing other Empire stuff early, right? I'm probably going to be going for Marienburg and Midland in the early game, and I might have to face off against Talabheim or whatever. So I'm going to be facing some units like that. So, excuse me, I'm going to be thinking, all right, well, mortars are going to be very good because they're going to have really like low armored, like just tons of infantry, tons of swordmen, tons of spears. So mortars are going to be really strong into that. Archers are going to be pretty good because spears and swords aren't going to be like that amazing against archers. They're fairly slow. You know, they are going to have a shield, but I don't remember if it's a silver or a bronze shield. But overall, they are going to be pretty weak to that kind of thing. And then if I can get some like lightly armored horses like some Reichsguard or even just Empire Knights or something like that, then that can help me neutralize their archers. So if I can knock out their archers with my cav and then use my archers flank and just kind of wear out their swordsmen and spears, then I should be able to win. So that's what I would be thinking. But it is kind of tricky because they're going to be doing the same type of thing, right? So that's kind of a weird one where it's your own race that you're fighting most of the time early on. Versus if you're starting as Skrulk, for example, down in Lustria, you're going to be fighting Lizardmen a lot as Skaven, and so you're going to want to rush things like Rat Ogres or things like Plague Claw Catapults early on, so that you're going to have the ability to deal with that heavy armor. It's also highly likely you're going to fight the Dwarves early on in that campaign, so same kind of deal. Now, the Dwarves are particularly weak to Catapults because they're very slow, and Catapults are good against missile infantry because they outrange them. So I would say Plague Claw Catapults would be a really good place to go there. If you are playing as Queek, for example, you're likely going to fight some Tomb Kings early on. So you're going to want to think, okay, well, what can I do to try to beat these Tomb Kings up? And you might want to invest more heavily in, I don't know, like some weapons teams, like some Deathglow Bombardiers or catapults are going to be pretty good against them as well. The catapults are pretty good against most things. But you see what I'm saying? You just want to think about who are my enemies early, what are they trying to do, and how can I beat them, and which power spike can I beat them in. Usually there's something around tier 3 that you can really like prepare for and leverage to your advantage, so it can be Rat Ogres or catapults. If you're Lizardmen, it might be the Red Crested Skinks if you're playing the Cult of Sotek. At tier 2, it could be Stegodons, maybe at tier 3. If you're playing as High Elves, maybe it's the Lothern Sea Guard or something that you're waiting on. If you're playing the Dark Elves, maybe it's going to be your, blanking out on the name, the infantry that I mentioned before. So just try to plan around that and think about how you're going to be able to gain a major advantage off of the AI. And then identify techs and skills that are going to allow you to spike harder. So think about what are some of the like specific units you can get that you can have early access to buffs for them. So I do have a game pulled up here, so I'm just looking at Cult of Sotek that I'm running through right now. So for example, if we just look through here, physical resistance for Skinks, leadership when fighting against Skaven, those are our sort of traits for him. And then overall, see we get that. So we're getting 10% physical resist for Skinks. Okay, so that makes us want to lean towards Skinks. Then if we look at some of our skills, we see, okay, we have Skirmisher. Okay, that gives extra melee defense for Skinks, weapon strength for Skinks, and missile damage for your missile Skinks. That's a triple buff on a single skill. That's really powerful. And it just happens to buff up Salamander Hunting Packs, which are a really good complement to Skinks. They can skirmish really well also, and they serve as very good cavalry in a sense. They're not quite as good as the other cavalry, but they're pretty close early on. And they're all in the same tree. So you can get Red Crested Skinks and eventually Salamander Hunting Packs right at tier 3. That's a very good progression. You now have a faction-wide or a Legendary Lord trait that's going to buff up the Skinks. You have a technology that's going to buff up the Skinks. It also buffs up another unit that complements the Skinks well, and they're all in the same tree here. So that would lead me to believe you want to be getting a lot of Skinks early. And the armor-piercing damage is very strong early on, as well as the poison. So those all kind of point towards the same things. And if you start looking at technologies, what am I getting? I'm getting Skink stuff, right? So I'm getting ammunition for Skinks, missile damage, and then eventually 10% weapon damage for Skinks as well. And then we have the sacrifices to Sotek we can look at here. So, you know, we can get extra armor that offsets the fact that they have really low armor early on. Also in this campaign, it's pretty easy to make that decision because with Saurus, one thing is we have upkeep plus 200% for Saurus. So Saurus is not an option early, so we kind of have to buy Skinks. But I'm just walking you through kind of the positive side of this. They go really hard on steering you away from Saurus to make you play something other than them early game because they're so overpowered. We can get leadership for skinks there. The armor offsets their low armor early on. So just everything is pointing towards that. And you have a right, which gives extra weapon damage, melee attack, and all this stuff to skinks. So this just all aligns. Like, oh my god, there's like 5 or 6 different things that we can use with this guy, with skinks, to power them up and make them very cost efficient. Because they're really cheap. They're only 151 gold. Saurus are more closer to like 225 after the upkeep penalties on Legendary. But that's the kind of thing that you want to be doing. You want to be scouting out and just seeing, you know, what can I get? How can it help out? And usually some combination of this will be starting off in the red tree and just maxing out one of these. So if we were doing like Krotgar or whatever, we'd probably go down here, melee attack and armor for Saurus. He gets some bonuses. I think he gets a 50% discount on Saurus, which is ridiculous. He's one of the best legendary lords in the game. But anyways, so if I were with him, playing with him, I would be going towards Proud Warrior for Saurus. Then I could make a judgment call and start going through the blue, or if I really wanted to go for like cold ones, we could try this out. But in general, I think that either going Proud Warrior or Skirmishers here is good, and then later on, you can revisit this if you decide to get Crocs and Temple Guards. This is really good. +8/+8 is a very, very strong buff. So those are really nice combat stats versus some of these other ones, like Swift Rider's okay. You get weapon strength and missile damage, but it doesn't give you any melee attack or defense. They're already really fast, so the speed doesn't matter as much. Same thing here on large units. Like the weapon strength is okay. The melee attack's pretty good. You just kind of want to figure that out. And then a big thing that people forget about when you're preparing for battle is cost efficiency. So you want to try to get the most amount of fighting out of the least amount of cost possible. So part of that might be looking to see if your faction gets a discount on certain units. So like I said, I believe that like Krotgar for the Lizardman gets a 50% discount on Saurus. That heavily incentivizes you to go more Saurus, because that's going to be more money for you to buy even more Saurus, or you can spend that money on more elite units. So the economy is really tough, especially on higher difficulties in this game. And so if you want to be able to buy something that's kind of elite later on, if you want to be able to buy, you know, Stegodons, or maybe you want to be able to buy some Rat Ogres or whatever, you're going to have a lot of cheap armies or a lot of cheap units in your army to finance that. Now, a way that you can help this out is in the blue tree. So that's why I recommend kind of going red tree, a few points in here, then usually going through the blue tree and grabbing upkeep reduction. It's usually called Fear and Renowned, and they change the name on this. It depends on the faction, but a lot of them have upkeep minus 15% for all units somewhere in there. You definitely want both of these. That just gives you huge reduction. And then Lightning Strike is really massive as well for winning fights, because it allows you to force a one-on-one. So especially against some of these swarming factions like Skaven, like Greenskins, Tomb Kings, these factions that are just going to send like waves and waves of units to you, and they're going to have tons of armies. This allows you to force that 1v1. So you may not be able to beat all 3 of those Skaven armies standing next to each other if you're Lizardmen, you know, in the mid game, but you can certainly beat them one-on-one. So if you have Lightning Strike, then you can do that. You can face them one at a time. So that's probably the most powerful skill in the whole game, I would say, across the board, especially for only costing 1 point. It's extremely strong. So I highly recommend going through the blue tree. And this is something that a lot of content creators underestimate, is just how powerful that blue tree is. Most people try to go for all the, you know, the fun stuff up here, the 4 fun skills, but this is actually like the bread and butter, like how you win on higher difficulties, is you control your cost. And as a general principle, if you can win the fight with less, like spending less money, then you should do it. You know, if you can win the battle and just conquer a region with a, you know, 3,000 gold army, there's really no reason to have a 6,000 gold army. You want to try to save that money so that you can build up your infrastructure, so that you can afford more elite units later on, and so that eventually you can summon more armies to go take more territory. Okay? So don't think that you have to sit in your town and just wait and summon up like a 10,000 gold army before you start going out and fighting people. So don't overkill it. You know, as with any strategy game, you want to be as efficient as you possibly can be. Okay, so just develop a strategy, play around your power spike. It's like, okay, you're going for catapults. All right, then, you know, maybe buff up the catapults in your skill tree. Maybe think about getting some spears to help protect them. So maybe get your clan rats up to tier 2 so that you can get the shields and spears with them. just try to think about how you can complement what you're going to do, right? So if you have really strong cavalry, maybe you would want to get less bows just because you're going to be flanking and trying to hit their archers, and you would friendly fire your own units if you fire bows at them. So bows become a lot less valuable if you're going to be getting a lot of cavalry early, and maybe you want to get more swords instead of bows, and that way you can have a stronger front line that can tie up and damage their spears a lot, and then that will allow your cav to get really strong flanks on the back. So that's something to think about. If you have really strong bows, maybe you want to go more spears and less cav. So if you're playing a faction that's going to have, like the Lothern Sea Guard, for example, they can kind of protect themselves, but you could potentially get more spears or more swords in that case. If you're going Dark Shards, for example, then maybe you don't need to go for any sort of their tier 3. I think they're called Dark Riders. You don't really need Dark Riders most of the time as Dark Elves because their tier 3 infantry are so strong and their missile infantry are so strong that you really can just go for a lot of the tier 3 units and then the Dark Shards. So just think about that. Just think about what's going to complement what's going to help you out tactically. And then focus on one key unit, like I mentioned before, and then build cheap elsewhere. So what's your power unit? Where are you going to spend most of your money? And then are there ways to save costs? Maybe you don't need to go clan rats with Skaven. Maybe you can get away with Skaven slaves. You don't always have to have, if you want a 10-stack infantry line or whatever, a 10-unit infantry line, maybe you could go half and half. Just go half slaves, half clan rats, so just try to cut costs wherever you can. If you can get away with it, if you can win the battle with less units or cheaper units, then you should definitely do it. And just remember that stat boosts in general end up helping weaker units more than stronger units. So if you get +8 melee attack and a unit only has 30 base melee attack, that's an extremely powerful buff because that's going to be increasing them by, I don't know the math on it, by a lot. Right, almost 25%, a little bit more than 25%, probably like 28 or something percent extra damage they're going to do off of that. Versus if you do +8 melee attack and they have 50, then you're only getting 16% bonus. Right, so percentage-wise, getting things like those buffs, like we were talking about to the skinks who have really low base melee defense of like 22 or something, getting +8 is massive on those. So always look for those opportunities, especially units that you're going to be able to spam a lot. So units that are cheap, that are going to kind of form the backbone of your army. So like clan rat type of units. If we're thinking about lizardmen, those red-crested skinks, we're going to be using them a ton. So try to buff up those units as much as you can. Also think about how likely is it you're going to get a lot of these units in your army. Okay. So some of those like tier 4 and tier 5 units, you're not going to be able to get a lot of those a lot of times because it requires you to have a massive town. So you can globally recruit later, but it's going to take forever to hire some dragons and things like that. And they're going to be really strong on their own. The dragons don't need a ton of help. They already kick a ton of butt. So you may not need to get a lot of upgrades on the dragons. At least it shouldn't be a very top priority to do that. So consider that versus if you're dwarfs. For example, like buffing up your dwarf warriors are massive because there are a lot of really good buffs. Don't forget those buffs stack multiplicative with each other. If there are like 2 technologies that buff up your dwarf warriors and there's like different lord skill trees that buff up your dwarf warriors as well, all of those stack up together on the same unit. And so if you can focus all of those buffs onto the same unit, that's going to make it a lot more combat effective. Versus if you just got like 1 tech for the dwarf warriors, 1 tech for the longbeards, 1 tech for slayers, it's not going to be as effective a lot of times because then it's not going to have that hyper focus. And you can hire dwarf warriors anywhere. So you can just occupy a town, put in a tier 1 recruitment building, and boom, dwarf warriors. Versus if you try to buff up your gyrocopters or something like that, you need a tier 3 town, which is going to take a lot longer. And I think you need a tier 4 building in addition to a tier 3 town to get the gyrocopters these days. So it's going to be a lot less likely you're going to be able to hire those on the fly. Because remember, as you're going and taking it over a bunch of territory, stuff's going to die. You're going to lose some of your units every now and then. You're going to have to replace those units. So ideally, you're replacing them with things that are very, very strong so that you can still have really high effectiveness. So just remember these things, like how accessible is the unit. If you play with the Steel Faith Overall mod, which I recommend, it's a wonderful mod. Even if you want to play on a lower difficulty, Steel Faith is still great. But one of the great challenges Steel Faith brings to the table is its capacity system that it introduced. So that actually forces you to have a very limited amount of elite units that you could have in your army. So now you have to choose, okay, do I want these 4 I only get 4 big elite units, so which ones do I want to get, right? Or I only get 6 of these specialized units, which ones do I get? So just keep in mind the accessibility. And if you're playing on that, you want to think, well, what is an exception to that? Are there certain units that are not considered special units, right? So I remember that like with the Lizardmen, the Saurus, for some reason, were considered special units, and you could not get a ton of them. But there were some other units at Tier 3 that were not considered special units. I remember the Lothern Sea Guard are not considered special units, for example, and they were very, very strong when I was going through the High Elf campaign. So you could just spam a bunch of them versus there are other types of units that are considered special that are like weaker potentially. So just that's kind of a different system with Steel Faith, is trying to figure out how to get maximum efficiency out of that. But anyways, so keep that in mind. And then finish off talking about some tactics here really quickly. You want to use tactics that complement your strategy. So it's really important to scout, to try to figure out what the enemy has. You can like take the hero out of your army, walk up, check them out, see if you can see what they have. If they're sieging your town and it doesn't show you all of the units, remember that you can always like press attack and then cancel the attack, and you can see their units that way. So just try to use your hero to scout. If there are other campaign mechanics, you can use your advantage. So if you're Skaven, for example, you can try to get ambushes. If you know they're going to be walking towards you and you're another faction, you could try to ambush as well. If you don't think you can beat them in a straight fight, that could be an option, specifically if you ambush and you are in reinforcement range of another army or of another town. That can work really well. So you can just sit there and look like you're exposed and just have someone in ambush sitting within reinforcement range. Sometimes that's a good way to catch people off guard. And there are other kinds of stances that you might be able to use too. So just think about your stances. Think about how you want to approach them. If you're playing a faction that has something like a Wa or a Bray Herd or just like these extra sort of macro units, be sure to play around that, right? If you're about to face a huge army and you're just like 1 point away from getting a Wa, why not just wait a turn and raid if you're greenskin and just get that Wa to tick up, or get that whatever green bar to tick up so you get the Wa for that next fight. So just try to think about that and play around that as much as you can. Use Lightning Strike, like I mentioned before, extremely powerful skill. You know, if there's an army sitting outside of a town and you want to attack that town, sometimes it's a lot easier just to Lightning Strike that army, take it out one-on-one, and then attack the town, so the town won't be able to reinforce that army outside the town. And then the army outside of the town will be dead when you attack the town. So use that Lightning Strike. Very, very powerful. If you have artillery, wait on them to come to you, obviously. Like, don't just run your infantry right into them if you have superior cannons or whatever. They will come to you if you have the superior firepower. This is not multiplayer. They're not going to hide an AFK in a corner for the first 20 minutes of the fight until you walk towards them to try to neutralize your artillery. Just keep that in mind. And these tactics that I'm going to talk about, speaking of which, are a little bit different for campaign than they are multiplayer. Multiplayer is just all about how much abuse can you possibly bring to the table. You know, what does CA refuse to balance correctly? Most of the time, so whether that means spamming all gyrocopters against greenskins, or whether that means trying to get a flying lord and snipe out the enemy lord with a bunch of magic missiles because you know they don't have very good anti-air. You can tell I'm a little jaded. I used to play multiplayer battles back in the day. And it's just always kind of a quirk of mine where people are like, oh, well, multiplayer is where the real skill comes in. You know, it's like sort of sometimes, but the balance is shaky too. I don't know. I might do some multiplayer. I might try it again. I just remember back in the day, it used to be all about lord sniping. So if you're playing in multiplayer and you're looking to cheese the maximum amount possible, usually you just try to snipe out their lord. Because usually people spend a lot of gold on their lords, so you're killing a lot of their money. And, you know, their lord's going to have a lot of spells. They're going to have a lot of skills. And if they die, then it hurts the morale of the entire army. So a lot of times if the lord drops, then they're going to lose. Or if you can kill their wizard, usually people put a lot of gold into upgrading their wizard with the spells and stuff. They're probably going to lose. So you can try that in single player, but I try not to do that too much. Occasionally you might have to do it. And sometimes focusing the lords depending on your faction can actually be a bad thing. So like Skaven, for example, do not have a lot of good ways to kill infantry lords early on in the game. They just don't have good armor piercing. They don't have good one-on-one units until you start getting assassins. most of the time. Queek is pretty good as a legendary lord one-on-one, but a lot of the Skaven are not going to be that great early on. So you don't even have to fight them. If you don't want to, just throw a bunch of Skaven slaves on them and just let them hack away at Skaven slaves for 7 minutes and just kill the rest of their army and then come back and focus fire them later. So depending on your faction, you might have a hard time with some lords. So you don't have to fight them. Like, you know, you can just tie them up a lot of the times. Yeah, they'll get a lot of kills on your Skaven slaves or your whatever trash tier infantry for your faction. But as long as you can keep them busy while you kill the rest of their faction, especially with swarming factions, that's a really good idea. Then that can work. But yeah, if you have artillery, wait. Try to get flanks whenever possible, and then don't siege without a plan. You always want to have an idea, how am I going to win this siege? So that might be cracking their walls early with a hero. That might mean just going into battle and cracking their walls with your artillery. You almost always want to take out their siege towers if you can. So if you're a faction with artillery, you know, you want to knock out those siege towers and then either break the walls and try to swarm them if you're a swarming faction, or if you have missile infantry, then try to use your missile infantry to soften them up over the walls. If you're not a faction with artillery, then you like vampire counts or something like that, then depending on your sort of composition, then you can just like climb the walls, or you can save up and get a battering ram or the siege towers to come in. So just kind of depends on what you're doing. I've had some people say, oh, well, that tactic's cheesy or something like that in battles. It's like that. It's different for every faction. I can win all sides of all sieges with any faction. Like every faction has an ability to win a siege. Some factions are just a lot better at sieges than others. But yeah, I mean, usually it's just common sense. Like you just want to line up on one side of the map, limit your surface area. Those towers are going to hit you if you have artillery, and then blow up the 2 towers that you need and then crack the walls and go in. Like why the hell would you start in the middle of the map if your goal is to take out, you know, limit your surface area and take out the siege towers? Why would you want to be focus fired by like 4 siege towers, you know, early on? So anyways, make sure you have a plan for sieging, and then flank whenever possible when you go in. So we're going to watch a fight here, and I'm just going to kind of narrate and tell you, I've got it silenced, but I'm going to narrate and tell you sort of what I was thinking, and I'll pause it here too and just kind of let you know about different sorts of preparations and things that you can do. Okay, so here we're going against Skaven. And this is going to be outside, so we have some pretty damaged skinks. They're coming at us, but we have Saurus, a couple of Saurus from our garrison, but mostly skinks. So this army is extremely infantry heavy, and so whenever you have a lot of infantry like that, one of the main things you want to do is control your surface area. So you do not want them all to blob up, especially with some of these factions that have really high infantry counts like Skaven. You don't want to blob up. You want to try to flank around with your extra infantry. So you don't want like 5 infantry, especially blobbing up around like their lord. So the worst thing you can do in most battles is to have like 3 or 4 of your battalions blob up and try to attack your lord, because there's just only so much surface area. Only 10 of those units are going to be able to hit the lord at once. And everything else is just kind of standing around. And that's how it works in Total War, is you have to give them commands to spread out to go attack something else. Otherwise, they will just blob. So we're going to have to figure out how to sneak around to their flanks as well. Now, we do have some skirmishing infantry, which is kind of a weird unit, but you have that. As Lizardmen, these have some ammo, so we can try to flank around with these, shoot them in the back, and then once they run out of ammo, then we can go in and fight. So these will be kind of our frontliners here. We also have this guy. I forgot, the Bastillodon has a ton of armor, a ton of health early on, and the Skaven are going to have a really hard time killing this guy. So we want to match this up if their lord comes in. We want to put this guy up against their lord so that our lord doesn't take a lot of damage, or really just put him up against almost anything. The main thing is we want to stop their gutter runners and some of these things from fighting the Bastillodon, because he doesn't have a shield. He does have a lot of armor, but he doesn't have a shield. And then the Rat Ogres we definitely don't want into the Bastillodon, because they do have armor-piercing damage, and they can actually hurt him. So I want to try to be aware of that as we go into this fight. Okay, so that's kind of our game plan, is to flank around with our skirmishers, use the Bastillodon to face tank some stuff. And we do have some magic. We do have Flock of Doom, so we do want them to be sort of bunched up as much as we can. Okay, so let me talk about some of this stuff here as we go through. Now, Usually if you have on the vanilla version of the game, if you have less than 15 wins of magic, you want to gamble because you can have anywhere from 0 to 30. So if it's less than half, you know, if it's 14 or 13, maybe, but definitely 9, you would want to gamble that. And I think we end up losing this gamble. No, we get it on this one. Okay, so I set control groups here, and this is very important. I see so many YouTubers actually don't set control groups, and I think they're putting themselves at a huge micro disadvantage by not doing that. So basically, on the unit cards here, you can click on a unit and then shift, and then click on another unit, and it will select all of them, and you can hold down control and press a number, and it'll move the unit into that control group. And what that means is if you double tap that key, it will allow you, or actually you don't have to double tap it. If you just single tap the key, it will select all of the units in that group. If you double tap it, it will take you to where they are on the map. So that allows you really quickly to access certain kinds of tactics. So for example, like I have the salamanders on their own thing because I usually have cavalry on their own sort of tactic. And so if I want to move the salamanders around, then I can just press 4. I know I've got the salamanders selected, and then I can use the shift key to draw a way for them to, a path for them to move and a path for them to flank. And then I can really quickly just press 2 again and jump right back over to like the skinks or to my skirmishers or whatever I want. So usually I'll have archers on a hotkey so that I can, once whatever they were focus firing starts running away or I need to switch targets, I can very quickly press like 2, switch back to the archers, and then have them then right click, have them click on another target. So that's so much easier than having to individually like click on each archer down here as you go through. And especially on lords and lords and your mages, that's really, really handy because then you can just press 9. You can really quickly look and see, okay, this spell's off cooldown, I'm going to use it. Then just click on the spell. I think there might be hotkeys for spells too, although I'm not 100% about that. But you can very quickly just select your lord, grab the spell that you want, and then move about, or just use any of their abilities, you know, if they have some kind of special buff that they can put on or whatever. So things that have a lot of activatables, either through items or spells, you definitely want to have those hotkeyed, and you want them on separate hotkeys as well. So I almost always put my lords and heroes on separate hotkeys. But usually I'll have, like, my 1 will be sort of your core line, grunt infantry. 2 will usually be my archers. 3 will be, you know, a lot of times like monsters or some kind of flanking infantry that I want. 4 will be a cavalry type of unit. 5 is usually if I have some kind of artillery, I'll put on 5. And then 6 through 10 are usually reserved for highly specialized units or heroes, things that are going to have activatables. And, you know, there's always a little bit of wiggle room for that, but that's something to keep in mind. Another option that you have here when you select these, you'll see this lock. If you press the lock button, it means the lock formation, which is kind of interesting if you want to set up certain kind of tactics. I don't think it's necessary to be like, oh, I'm going into, you know, phalanx for this fight. I think a lot of times that's just really ineffectual. You need to be able to adapt and adjust to what's going on in the battlefield. So I don't highly recommend having like highly regimented locked formations that you're going to use. But a good use for this lock key, whenever you press it and you press attack, like you just right click, they will all march forward and attack the closest thing to them. That also works with archers. It attacks the closest thing. So this is amazing because if you try to, if I like have my 2 key on the red skinks here and I click on this first unit over here, they're all going to like converge and just run at that single unit. They won't spread out at all, and they will just sort of like pile up around that unit, and it's going to be very ineffective. But if you lock it and then you right click, all of your units march forward in a single line, and then they'll attack whatever's closest. So they'll attack just anything that's right in front of them as they go, so that way they don't all ball up on one unit. So that's an amazing thing. If you don't do that, you absolutely have to do that. It helps you a ton. Otherwise, you're going to have to individually click each one of these units and give an individual command to each for like each person you want them to attack. And you can adjust that. So maybe, for example, you could lock this and then right-click to have all of these move forward on march forward towards a single unit, and then maybe you want to keep 2 of them separate that you want to flank around with. You can do that. So just because the formation is locked doesn't mean that you can't move individual units. It just means that if you click 2 and issue a command, everyone's going to do that. But you can still control individual units if you click on them. So that's something that's really important. And then I also mentioned the shift key. People ask me this all the time. If you hold down shift while you have a unit, you can left click and drag, and you can create a path for a unit. So this is very good for flanking. You can like tell your cavalry to like path around, and you'll see like these yellow arrows when I do this fight because I'm telling them to path. And if they run into something there, then they'll fight it. So you can actually path directly into, so I could like draw this over here, and they would path, and if I end my drag on the enemy archers, they will path all the way around and then go hit the archers. So you can tell individual units to path, or you can tell entire faction, or like entire number groups to path as well. Now, if you tell a number group to path, sometimes you'll see there'll be like these really weird arrows that don't line up appropriately. Sometimes it's a little janky if you're trying to path a bunch of units at once. So just keep aware, watch how those arrows are interacting, and adjust if you need to. But individual units pathing is great. Okay. So as we're setting up here, we've got kind of these skinks, and I realized I put those in the wrong group, so we're going to put those in a different group. I've got those in 6 for now. These have Vanguard deploy, so I'm going to try to move them up as soon as I can. And I just want to try to get as much harassment as I can on these Rat Ogres specifically. Those are the most dangerous things that they have. Because I don't have any spears right now, so I don't get any bonus versus large, and they're very, very good against the rest of my units. Actually, these are spears. The 2 Saurus that I have are spears. So ideally, I would match the spears up with the Rat Ogres. I don't think I do that, but that would be optimal. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit here. All right, so I walked up. Actually, that was a bit too fast. Okay, so here we go. Now, Rat Ogres are kind of fast, too, though, so we have to be careful messing with them. I'm moving him up so that I can get off a Flock of Doom here. It's very low range. If you upgrade, it can get to higher range. But now, my skirmishers against theirs, I think they have an edge cost-wise because theirs are just slaves, and I don't have shields or anything yet. Trying to get the Salamanders now to focus fire the Dragon Ogres. As you can see, they're firing on them. They get a bonus versus large. So we're trying to get them to focus out. Now, the true skirmishers, these blow dart skinks, have skirmisher stance, which means they will naturally run away from anyone that gets close. The salamanders, however, do not have that. So you have to be very careful with microing the salamanders. And I think I get them caught a little bit here. Okay. We're just trying to apply as much damage as we can. So I'm running the salamanders back. You notice I just locked the skink formation, and then I'm just going to charge forward with them. So I just right-click on that. You can see these red arrows. That's how the skinks are going to move. So they all just start running in that direction. They attack anything that's close to them. And then I'm kind of individually, like, just sort of looking at what's going on here. Okay, do another Flock of Doom. Just trying to soften up their skirmishers. As you can see, they are beating me over here with these Night Runners. There's just more of them, and they do more damage than my skinks do. We're trying to bring in the big guy here just to get into the middle of their infantry line. And he has a spell that I'll activate here in a second. There it goes, which does AoE damage. Then you'll notice here I'm trying to drag and walk these around. They can fire in there, but they're not going to be as effective firing over your own troops. Okay. So we're just kind of waiting on Flock of Doom. We're hitting the magic. We want to make sure we're doing that Flock of Doom every time. You can hold down, I believe it's Alt, and it will target the ground. It might be Control. I can't remember off the top of my head. But I think you hold down Alt, and it will, if it's like an AoE spell, and it will target the ground and not get locked targeting an individual unit. Okay. So my Stegodon's in there face tanking a ton of stuff. I neglected to throw the Saurus in there, so we're throwing them in there now. My Lord was taking a pretty good chunk of damage, so I decided to run him out. Okay, we broke this flank here. We just overpowered him, so now we're running through. So what we want to look for is finish the rest of this off, run through, flank around. And then, like, that's usually one of the best ways I find to win a lot of fights is to collapse one of the flanks, like one of the side flanks, and then just cascade that, and then just slowly wrap around. You guys can't see my hand. I'm saying just to, like, slowly wrap around. So right here, kill this, and then we want to wrap around here and flank the rest of their units and just completely encircle them over time. So usually I find that's really effective if you can break one of those flanks. Okay, so we're rotating over there. Okay, now you've noticed we've moved our skinks around here to kind of this flanking formation, and we're just using up all of our ammo firing into their back. That breaks them. Remember, like we talked about in the last video, like the best thing you can do is flank a lot of the times if you can do it safely. They don't have cavalry, so I can run around with those comfortably on the sides. Shooting things in the back or charging them in the back causes extra leadership penalty. Their shields don't work, so you get to bypass a lot of their shields. And you get charge bonuses and things like that if you hit them in the back. And you get a really big surface area. So you're doing damage not only all in the front, but now you're doing damage to their back as well. So they're just going to be taking a tremendous amount of damage, and your units that are flanking usually aren't getting hit themselves. So they have very limited surface area. If you sandwich them by flanking, they have like half the surface area you're going to have, and you're causing leadership penalties. You're getting charge bonuses, all this other stuff. So flanking is really, really key. As long as you're not going to get flanked yourself by doing that, and as long as, you know, they don't have cav or missiles or anything else going to be hitting you. Okay, so now we are rotating over here. We're trying to break that line. They still have some infantry around here, so we're running up here a bit more. We probably just need to, yeah, just run at those skirmishers. They're going to outrun me probably, but just try to tie them up. Sometimes if they have a skirmisher advantage in this fight because they have more and stronger skirmishers than I do. There's some more Flock of Doom. Sometimes just running like some trash units at them or things with shields that can soak up their missiles really easily. It's okay to let them kite you as long as you're aware of it if you don't have another solution to the skirmishers. So like right now I'm just running at them with these Saurus spears. Those are my garrison units, so it doesn't really matter if they take casualties or die. So I'm just running at their skirmishers even though I'm not going to catch them, just to get them out of here so that I can kill the rest of their army. And then eventually either the skirmishers will run out of ammo. Okay, now these guys are going to come in and clean up their rallying units. The skirmishers are going to run out of ammo, or we're going to do so much damage to the rest of their units that their leadership is going to fall to critical levels, and the battle's just going to be over. Because remember, the more units that you kill in a fight, it causes leadership damage to the entire army. Slowly, but it builds up over time. So sometimes if they have a really tough unit to deal with, like a lord that I mentioned before, you can just kill the rest of their army and just tie them up, just keep them busy. Or these like annoying skirmishers. And then you'll just win the fight anyway. So that's pretty much what's going to happen here in a second. So we're just sending some more units over here to deal with him. Now, if you're actually trying to kill a lord, you want to get the trash units out of there. So you don't want like your little dinky units to take up surface area. You just want to put your heavy hitters on that lord. Because remember, there's only so much surface area. Like that model only has so much units around it. So you can put 500 units around that lord if you want. There's only going to be 10 hitting it at a time. So you might as well make it your best 10. Now, halberds, that's why halberds are so good in general. We talked about this last episode, is they have a range of 2. So against lords that are on mounts, you can actually get 2 of your rows to attack them. So instead of 10, there might be like 25 attacking them. A little bit more than double because as you expand out, obviously the radius is going to increase the area. Okay. So we're just running at them over here. Now, the Skaven slaves, they are skirmishers, but they cannot fire while moving because they're like trash tier units. So if you just run at them, they're actually not going to be able to fire. Night runners can. But yeah, so their lord just broke, so we win. So even though we didn't kill these, even though we cannot run those down, we could chase them infinitely and we would never catch them. Just because we routed their lord at the end and the rest of their army had taken so many casualties, then they were going to run off the field as well. It is very helpful, and this is one of the last things I'll say here because I don't want this guy to take too long. It is very helpful to have at least one cavalry unit or just something fast in your army just so you can run people down at the end of fights is a really big deal because I'm going to have to fight these guys again because they're all going to run away. If they're in a town, then they all die automatically, but if it's open field, they're going to get to run away. So it's really nice if you can just have something to run people down. So I have the salamanders, but that's all I have right now to run people down. And we're making sure we at least kill their lord. So you see how long it's taken to kill this guy, even though we have like 1 million units there? Because they all can't hit him. Okay. But I think that's pretty good for this video. I don't want it to be too long. I did want to touch on magic a little bit. I might make a separate magic video. We'll see. I have talked about that in several other guides already. Just kind of the TLDR, I think that in ranking order, these are some of the highest ones or some of the best ones that you need to think about. There are some factions that are like I don't even know, like 16 different schools of magic right now. But life magic, I think overall is almost always the strongest, especially in the base game. It has really good, well, I'll just hit on it for 5 minutes here, and then I can do an entire separate video if you want about it. I'll just hit the best ones here. Life magic is almost always really strong. Now, some of this has changed in Steel Faith, so if you use the Steel Faith mod, it's going to be a little bit different. But it's a very cheap... what you're looking for with magic in general for combat is how cheap is the spell versus how effective it is. So think about it as like your gold, right? You have this resource, this winds of magic. It's like your gold for magic in the battle. You want it to be as efficient as you possibly can. So you don't want to pay 10 magic for a spell where you could get a more powerful or similar effect with something that would only be 6 magic. Same principle is why you don't want to spend gold on a 20,000 gold army when a 6,000 gold army will do, you know, for what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so this is really good. A main thing you're looking for is area of effect. So things that have effect range that can affect multiple units are almost always going to be way stronger than single target. So healing is also really strong because whenever you heal units, for them to do damage back to those units, they have to cut through the armor again. They have to cut through the shields, the melee defense, the physical resist, all of that stuff they have to cut through. So healing, as in most strategy games, is extremely powerful. It's way more powerful than damage a lot of times. So this is particularly good if you have like large monster units or just like very heavily defensive units. This healing magic is going to be very strong, and it can affect everybody in a 30-yard range, and you can upgrade it to get double the effect. So extremely strong magic. This is okay. It's cheap. It does some damage. It's probably the weakest spell in the tree, but it's all right. This, once again, very effective. Only 7 magic. This helps buff up a single entity unit a lot. It lasts 44 seconds, 60 armor. This is really great. You know, if you have like a lord you're trying to protect or like a very large monster you're trying to protect, just something to soak a lot of damage, that can be very powerful. This, AoE, 40 meters, gives everybody, and this is just really overpowered in the base game. Only 8 magic, 22 physical resist, plus weapon damage. 40 meters. So you can put this on your entire army for 8 magic. Very strong. Tons of healing on a single entity for 30 seconds. This thing will bring up like a unit like 4,000 health. You can heal like a third of your lord's health, maybe even more off of this. So, and it gives them perfect vigor again, which is gonna, you know, give them a lot of armor and a lot of their other stats back. So that's really strong. And then it has a very powerful vortex spell at the end. This is one of the strongest vortex spells in the game. It just does a severe amount of damage to combatants, and it's stationary. Most vortex spells in the vanilla campaign, they move around, and so you're not sure just how effective they're going to be, and they're really expensive. This is still, so you know exactly where it's going to be, and you could plan around that. Skaven has something similar to that, and that's the last magic I'll talk about here, just kind of as a teaser for magic. But Skaven has a very similar profile. This is why these are 2 of the strongest magics in the game. It has a stationary, very large magic damage spell, AoE Vortex, that when you upgrade it goes down to like only costing 8 magic, which is absurd. They nerfed this a lot in the Steel Faith overall mod. This is really strong. They have a very good debuff. This effectively means that all of your units are taking 20% less damage for 5 magic, which is very strong. They have a very nice like mid-game wind spell, which can do decent damage. They can summon up rats. This is like having an extra unit, which is very, very powerful, and you can do that 6 times, and if you upgrade this, it only costs 3 winds of magic to summon one of these things. So you can just spam this like all day and just completely tie up their lines. It's very good for like soaking charges. Got some cavalry coming at you, no problem. Vermintide, intercept the cavalry charge. You know, you need some flanks behind people, no problem. Just summon these right behind them and flank them. Like, there's so many uses for this. You have really heavy armor shred for only 10 that lasts 50 seconds. You can sunder 30 of their armor if you upgrade it for just 6 more. It's 60 armor. This basically means people are going to be taking just straight damage. Most units are. So that's just really, really strong spells overall that are very cost efficient. So I could go on and on. I did mention fire magic earlier, so I'll talk about fire magic again for the Dark Elves. Same profile. 4 magic. Buffs up. No, it only lasts 19 seconds. This is a really good buff to your monsters. Adds melee defense and armor-piercing damage, which is good. This is one of the backbone spells of them. 19 seconds. I think they've nerfed this. I feel like it used to be 25 seconds. So they've nerfed this tree a little bit, but it's still pretty good. 25% weapon damage or missile damage, and it adds magic and fire. So this is excellent for taking out like Banshee type of units, ethereal units, or things with a lot of physical resist. That's going to be handy. Now, Burning Head, it's still really, really strong. This is probably one of the best pound-for-pound wind spells in the game. It does a ton of magic damage. It's very easy to aim, huge hitbox, and adds a leadership penalty, so they're more likely to run away. So these 3 things, you can just spam Cascading Fire, Flaming Sword of Ruin, and Burning Head. Just completely decimate armies, especially low armor, clumped up infantry units. This just completely wrecks them. Early game. And then this stuff is okay later on. You got Piercing Bolts, and you have a Vortex spell, which is pretty good. This is a lot better on Steel Faith with this Vortex, but overall pretty strong. Anyways, that's going to be it for this video. I've already gone over budget. I really need to try to keep these guides to an hour or less. Definitely not more than an hour 15. So thank you very much to Westworld. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this helps you out, understand combat, and develop some better tactics out there. Be sure to watch some of my legendary campaigns. I do explain a lot about my decisions that I make during the campaigns. And if you come by and ask me during a stream, which once again I stream starting around 1:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time after the league stream, then I'm happy to answer any questions you have about specific units that you might be interested in, specific tactics for certain races, how to do certain things in combat, or what you should be prioritizing. I'm happy to talk with you about anything that you'd like while I'm running the campaign. You can even come by during the league stream if you want. If you can't, stay up that late or whatever, you want to stop by the league stream around 10 p.m., I'm happy to answer Warhammer questions during the league stream as well. So just stop by. We'd love to have you. It's a wonderful, friendly community. And yeah, that's going to be it. Stay tuned for future content. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. It's free. It's easy. It just takes a couple of clicks. If you'd like to commission a guide yourself, maybe a more extended magic guide, or if you want me to do a specific guide for a specific faction, really in depth, I can do that for you. Like I said, I have a Skaven one from about a year ago, but I'm happy to do it with any other faction that anyone wants to sponsor as well. So that's going to be it. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.